Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the kickoff event of Black History Month here at NYU Gallatin. Welcome to the spring semester, and welcome to a very terrific event that we have planned for you this evening. It's really a wonderful way for us to start the semester. NYU Gallatin is an interdisciplinary school of individualized studies within New York University. In the Urban Democracy Lab, who is sponsoring this event tonight, is an initiative within Gallatin. We seek to provide a space to debate and promote alternative urban futures that are just, critical, and sustainable. And sometimes, in thinking forward, one of the most important things we have to do is think back and look back critically and listen to those who have lessons to teach us, which is why we're doing this wonderful event tonight. A couple of thank yous before we get started. First of all, the Black History Month Committee in the Gallatin's Office of Student Life and Student Affairs, Dean Suzanne Wofford, and of course, as always, the staff that make these events possible. So Jason Lanning, Jennifer Burge, Monique Sorrell, Victor Bautista, Becky Amato, and many others. Thank you. So let me introduce our wonderful speakers this evening. Salamisha Tillett is an associate professor of English and Africana Studies and a faculty member of the Alice Paul Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at University of Pennsylvania. She has her PhD in the History of American Civilizations, MA in English from Harvard University, and her MAT from Brown. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Pennsylvania, where she received her BA in English and Afro-American Studies. Her most recent book, Sites of Slavery, Citizenship and Racial Democracy in the Post-Civil Rights Imagination by Duke University Press, examines how contemporary African-American artists, writers, and intellectuals remember antebellum slavery within post-civil rights America in order to challenge the ongoing exclusion of African-Americans from America's civic myths to a model of racially democratic future. In 2010, she edited the Kalalu, a Journal of African Diaspora and Letters special issue on Ethiopia. Her work has also appeared in many different outlets, including American Literary History, American Quarterly, Kalalu, Novel, Research in African Literatures, Savoring the Salt, The Legacy of Tony Coly Bambara, Violence in the Lives of Black Women, and many others. And she's currently working on a book on the civil rights icon Nina Simone. She's also the co-founder of A Long Walk Home, a nonprofit organization that uses art to end violence against women, girls and women. Thank you and welcome. And our other guest of honor this evening, who also elevates us with her presence tonight, is Lynn French. She was a member of the Black Panther Party from 1969 until 1973, working Chicago as well as Oakland and Berkeley. In the party, and how nice to be able to say stuff like this. In the party, she worked in a variety of areas, including newspaper circulation, labor, finance, breakfast programs, food and clothing giveaways. She walked the picket line during the Bill Boyett boycott in Oakland and was instrumental in starting child care centers in Berkeley and Chicago. After leaving the party, French lived and worked in Cambridge, Mass. From 73 until 76, where she co-founded and co-administered International Daycare Center. During those years, she was employed as the Cambridge Somerville Community Representative for the Massachusetts Office for Children. Since graduating law school in 1979, French has worked in community development and housing policy in Washington, D.C., working on equitable alternative to gentrification, an issue that, as you know, we care a lot about. She worked at the Council of the District of Columbia until 1987, the D.C. Department of Housing and Community Development as Homestead Program Administrator, and as Senior Policy Advisor for Homeless and Special Needs Housing in the Executive Office of the Mayor in Washington, D.C. She now serves as Executive Director of Hope and Home, a transitional housing program for low-income homeless families, supporting their efforts to break the cycle of poverty and achieve self-sufficiency and independence. She also works with tenant groups and nonprofits seeking to develop affordable housing. Welcome.
So I just want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you for our host, particularly Becky, who sent an email this fall, I suppose, inviting us and encouraging us to attend and launch Black History Month here. So we're just both honored to be here and to be in the presence of all of you in the room and in the world of the cyber world that we can't see you. We're going to do a kind of interview conversation format, primarily because Lynn knows so much, but also her experience and expertise as a member of the party, I think, is really why we're here. And I would love to just continue the conversation about women in the Black Panther Party that got sparked in some ways for me with Stanley Nelson's documentary, and then it inspired the piece I wrote in the New York Times about the party as a kind of feminist space and what that means. Do you want to say anything before we jump right in?
No, you're speaking for me.
Okay, well, you're going to be speaking. Well, I guess the first question that I have of anyone is, what's the story? Like, how did you join the Panther Party, and what drew you to the Panthers in Chicago?
Okay, so I don't know if it's a straightforward story, but when I graduated from high school in 1963, the world was so different from the way it is now. And the only options out there for African American women seemingly were either you cleaned someone's house, you became a school teacher, or you married someone who would take care of you. And none of those options embodied the vision I had for myself and my life. And I have to say as an aside that I come from, as my father would say, a long line of women who knew themselves and spoke their minds. So it just wasn't my concept. And I dabbled a little, I worked a little with SNCC, but I was a little younger than SNCC people. And by the time, really I joined in 68, joined the Black Panther Party. I was living in Chicago, Illinois. I was a student. And I met Bobby Rush and Fred Hampton when they were organizing the Illinois chapter. And it was the first organization, I'd been in a variety of organizations, but this was the first organization that, first place I saw as saying, we have a vision for ourselves in this world, and we aren't asking for permission to be these people or to envision this world. This is the world we want to build. We want to have our own agency to live our lives the way we feel we should live them, rather than having someone giving you permission to come to their restaurant or permission to come to their theater. We wanted to assert ourselves. And it was, I saw, it was within within the party, women had equal status to men. So it didn't even occur to me that this was a feminist action, but just that we were asserting ourselves to build a world that we thought would be the world we wanted to pass on to our children. And so to me, it's all part and parcel of the same thing.
So one of the things that was interesting for me in doing research, and you think you know a lot about a lot of different things, and particularly African American history, 20th century African American history, but the fact that the Panther Party, by the time you joined, 1968, was over 2/3 women in terms of the membership, struck me as both amazing on one hand, but also there's a sense that these women weren't the rank and file of the Black Panther Party. The dominant images that we still have are African American men with leather jackets and berets, and so I wonder, what do you think causes the disparity between the reality as you all lived it and our imagination or our memory of the time?
Well, first place, I really believe that most, if not all, of the women who joined the Black Panther Party were leaders and had the same vision of building a world. I think that there are a couple things with the image that was drawn. We were considered a huge threat to the United States, to the status quo. And so the image that was reflected in the newspapers, if you look through the newspapers of that era, just show us as this, it's a broad brush of just some black men with guns who are going, if you don't watch out, they're going to all wipe us out, So they never looked at us with any depth or saw any complexity or what have you. But that wasn't how we saw ourselves. And if you look through issues of the Black Panther newspaper, you see women very positively displayed, whether it's in the art that's there or in the articles. So I think it's more, and then because of the whole history with the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover calling us the #1 threat to security in America, we were then what I guess ISIS is considered now, but we weren't going around bombing people or anything. We were just trying to assert ourselves and build a world. Because they were chauvinistic, they just saw it as coming from men, so they arrested a whole lot of the guys. And the women went unnoticed in a lot of ways because they didn't see us with any complexity. I mean, I was arrested. Don't get me wrong, but but they were, they saw it as a black male thing, and I think that's a repeating pattern ever since African Americans have been in this country, whether it was as slaves or during the Great Migration or in contemporary times, that black men within the imagination of mainstream American culture are seen as a threat. Which is pretty curious that they, it says something more about them than it does about us.
So I listened to a conversation that you did a few years ago, and you talked about the Panther Party being the most progressive place to be as a woman in the late 60s, and you've touched upon that a little bit, but I think that would strike a lot of people as maybe unusual or new or curious in the sense of we don't think about black nationalism in the Black Panther Party as a place of progressive gender politics. And even by the early 70s, even a place in which like Newton's writing a piece about gay and lesbian and people being part of the movement and ending homophobia. So there's another thing about these myths about the Panther Party. It's male dominated, it's highly sexist. But I wish you could just elaborate.
That's why we were the vanguard. That's why the name of that movie is Black Panther Party, Vanguard of the Revolution. I mean, we were the advanced thought, and the party evolved from the Black Power movement. In 1965, when Stokely Carmichael first used that phrase, it just jumped out there quickly, and a lot of African Americans my age were more pulled to Black Power at that point than to sit-ins and all that, and especially in urban areas. But once we got started and started talking about what the world should be and what people should be, we really weren't. I don't know if we were black. I mean, we saw ourselves as a positive image, but we had allies in Chicago. We started the first Rainbow Coalition. There were the Young Lords who were Chicano, the Young Patriots who were hillbillies from Appalachia who came to Chicago, and there were Chinese organizations. There was a whole variety of organizations that were our allies, and they organized themselves around the same principles as our 10-point program. And we started a Rainbow Coalition. We took old Richard Nixon buttons that they were giving out and we painted over top of them and painted different colors. And that was in 1969. So we really evolved from just being Black Power to really seeing a different world, I think.
So can you just talk a little bit about the SNCC women and how, I know you were too young to be one of them, but Kathleen Cleaver said in my conversation with her that by the time she arrived in Oakland, that her image of Black womanhood was so tied to those early moments of SNCC and the organizing that she saw amongst the men and women, but particularly the women, that it created a model of what kind of activist she wanted to be. And so she never doubted for a second that women should be leaders, because that's what she inherited from SNCC. And if you could just,
I had the same reaction. When I was young, I used to I would go to SNCC demonstrations and sometimes without permission, because I didn't yet have the agency to just say this is what I'm going to do. But I believe that women from SNCC and women from the Black Panther Party are cut out of the same cloth. When you think of SNCC women facing what they faced in Mississippi and all across the South with the bombings and registering people to vote, it took a lot of courage to do what they did. And although there was still more to be done by 1965, they really unseated segregation in the South. And again, it was largely the women in the organization who were doing that work.
So there was
Some of the women I most admire were in SNCC, like Joyce Ladner.
Well, I guess another thing I've been thinking about based on what you were describing is, so the state surveillance, state suppression of the movement, being this revolutionary vanguard people during the reign of Nixon and the kind of backlash towards the civil rights movement, but also the rise of the silent majority. I mean, we know what came with Nixon. But part of it is that the men were primarily targeted, but you did speak about how, you have this two things going on. Women also are being arrested. Erica Huggins talks about this in great detail. But also the fact that men were targeted left space for women to kind of rise in the party and enact leadership positions. And so it seems almost like a kind of a contradiction.
Well, I think we had leadership positions from the beginning.
Yep.
But as time progressed, you were aware of there being more and more women than men because of that. For example, in Chicago, women were in the leadership from the beginning. But once Fred Hampton was murdered in his sleep in December 1969, a whole lot of people left the party wholesale. They were scared, and with good reason. And so some people stuck it out and some people didn't, but they were really not making any bones about really lashing out at black men. I understand. I saw. I have some really. We talked about our mutual feelings about Chicago. I'm very much feeling what's going on in Chicago now, because to me it's a continuation from the time of the Great Migration when people went from Mississippi to Chicago wholesale. The Chicago Police Department was like being another KKK there and keeping people in place. There's a history of men rising to the position of being competitive to become an alderman, and alderman is a very powerful position there. And at least 2 were murdered. One in broad daylight by 4 or 5 police officers in the 20s, and then it happened again in the 60s, just before I moved there. And so it's just a very powerful, repetitive thing going on there.
So, I mean, let's stay with Chicago, because it's a place, we both call it like a second home. It's a place of your radicalizing and your being involved in the Panther Party. I do a lot of community and political work in Chicago as well. And so it's almost, Chicago is, and I was there last week on a panel on Chirac, which is very controversial to talk about Chirac, the movie in Chicago, I must say. But understandably.
And a very controversial mayor doesn't like it, so who cares?
Yeah. Exactly. But I mean, this repetition of violence, or the ritual of white supremacist violence against black bodies.
It's like they have permission to do it. It's just,
well, in a way, they do, right?
Yeah.
And I was thinking about like organizing in North Lawndale and Homan Square being a kind of a site of torture for many recently
and that
outed
still goes
as such.
on, even though it's been widely publicized.
Yeah.
I don't know if you all know that, but there's a place in Chicago where police will take, it's a whole building, and they will detain someone, mainly African American males, or Latino males, take them to this place and torture them and try to beat confessions out of them and all that. And because they haven't yet officially arrested them, they're just being detained. There's no way to even know that they're there. So you could be looking for someone and calling around and even call the Chicago police and say, do you know where Joe is? And they'd say, no, we don't know where Joe is, but Joe may be held and being tortured. And it's really a horrible thing, and it's been exposed, and it still goes on. Mm-hmm. Or the thing I was leading to before about the Chicago police, when they murdered Fred Hampton, it was just really horrific circumstances. And there's a photo that I have I don't know if any of you have seen it, it's just a powerful photo of the policeman carrying Fred's body out of the apartment. And he's like under a blanket, you can just sort of see his feet sticking out, and they're laughing. And I read somewhere recently that they have these annual, I don't know if it's get-together times or something once a year where they meet, and the picture that I saw from this meeting was they had that mounted on the wall. Mm-hmm. So it's like they're still celebrating or remembering that as the good old days when they murdered Fred and really got away with it. Mm-hmm. I mean, what has changed?
Mm-hmm. So part of what is not new, but I think inspired by the work that you've done, is the kind of emergence of youth organizing. I mean,
I'm very hopeful about that.
And what's striking again about the Panthers, not only was it 2/3 women, but it was such a young movement. I mean, young in the sense that the majority of people were under the age of 25. Mm-hmm. And now we have a kind of corresponding movement of Black Lives Matter. And then in Chicago, there are a number of organizations, youth-driven organizations, sometimes at odds with the old guard, and sometimes, just at the forefront of the movement. But, what is, I know we're in New York, and so we love New York, but I would like to, what is unique about Chicago in terms of, obviously there's deep state repression, and also real entrenched segregation. But it seems to me that there's also kind of possibility for all kinds of organizing that, cross-fertilization, coalition building. I mean, it's a really, really hotbed of deep political activism.
And when at least when I lived there were all kinds of organizations. It's an extension. I just see that link between Mississippi and Chicago, where it wasn't just black folks who migrated, but white people. One time during the 90s, my brother and I went to a bar association meeting in Chicago, and he hadn't really spent I don't know if he had ever been to Chicago before, but he's a lot younger than I am. But we were walking down the street, and he commented, "This is the whitest place I've ever been." And he said, it's almost like they're in Mississippi and they want us to get off the sidewalk to get out of their way. I mean, it's just something that he picked up there, and it's just always sanctioned. I mean, New York, Chicago, and LA are in a category of their own in terms of big cities in this country. And of those three, Chicago is still like the old South in a lot of ways. And with all those millions of people, it's still a very balkanized place. There's still a lot of segregation there. There are a lot of just places that people don't go, things that people don't do. And it's just amazing to me. I mean, it produced some wonderful blues, but you really see why people sing the blues,
I didn't know. I thought you were going to say produce Barack Obama. Produces the blues. Another thing. I mean, speaking of Bobby Rush and Chicago and your kind of introduction to the party through a professor, Charles Hamilton, who co-wrote the Black Power book with.
He didn't introduce us to the party. Charles Hamilton co-wrote a book with Stokely Carmichael. I guess it was 1967 or 66 that they wrote this book together called Black Power. And I don't know if people still read it, but I consider it a classic. And he taught political science at my college. So everybody who was thinking that way would fight to get into his classes. And from that, we organized one of the first black student unions. Now I guess everybody takes that for granted that you have a black student association or something at your school, but that was even a radical thing there. And we were organizing it, and we needed a speaker. And one of our classmates, Bill Hampton, said, well, I have this brother who's a really good speaker. He belongs to the NAACP youth movement. We should invite him. And that's how we met Fred.
Oh, okay. Okay, so.
And right around that time, Martin Luther King was assassinated, too. So it's sort of like a melting pot going on there, or some kind of, I don't know.
Yeah, just so catalysts for different activity. So I guess one of the things a big question I have is in terms of gender equality and racial justice, like, so much of, even today, while we think of Black Lives Matter, we know that Black Lives Matter comes from this really radical place. Last week, Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi, two of the three women who founded Black Lives Matter and coined the term, spoke at Penn. And so one of the questions that I asked them was about, the intersection between racial justice and gender equality, and what happens when we imagine racial equality without this other component. Because it still seems to me that, and this may be just the media response, but even with Black Lives Matter, coming from three queer Black women, really centering the lives and experience of trans Black men and Black women, that there's an attempt to not include that, to sort of see it within this other tradition of exclusively around African American male leadership, and the fact that this movement is so consciously leaderful and pushing against one model leadership, one charismatic male leader. Like it's so self-consciously trying, in some ways, I think inheriting.
I think it's great that they're doing that.
Yeah, and inheriting a SNCC tradition and a Panther tradition. But, oftentimes we think about racial justice without thinking about where gender equality fits in or where sexual equality fits in. And I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about, I know you don't see them as separate things.
I mean, I think they're all the same thing, aren't they?
I mean, I would say so, but I think there's a way in which we're conditioned to think of them as
I agree.
distinct, and so
People are conditioned, and popular culture leads you to certain ways.
to understand them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what were the challenges? Like, even if it were this vanguard space where people were really wrestling in real time with such progressive practices. I mean, people were living together, they're working together.
It was never easy, because everybody came into the party being the person they were. So, there were many times you had to assert yourself as, wait a minute, you don't speak for me, you don't control me. But we were dealing not only with them, but with our own families and with people outside who thought we were crazy. I mean, we were talking about things that people just, I was arrested just before Fred Hampton was murdered. I lived in the apartment where he lived, but I happened to be somewhere else, and I was arrested. And at first, my parents refused to bail me out of jail. One, because they were scared, and my father kept saying to me, "Come on, anybody with common sense knows that if you rock the boat, this is what's going to happen to you." And so my dear cousin came and bailed me out. But we were a lot of people were looking at us askance, and you just sort of had to know your own mind and assert yourself the way you wanted to be. It's never easy. Change isn't easy.
So how did you resolve it with your parents, or did they?
Yeah, they came to the point where they were very proud of the fact that I'd been in the party. And it's funny, I had a grandmother who I adored, who lived to be 95, and she never criticized me for it. People would, even though she may have had questions in her mind, she would say to people, "She knows what she's doing," and you have to respect that people follow. I think that my parents were more reacting from fear than anything else, and we did resolve that.
So one of the things that's interesting too, or unique about the Panther Party, are the multiple programs, and the multiple platforms that you all were engaged in and creating. And again, that's part of like the vanguard identity. But it's also, and I'm not trying to link it to gender, like women do this and men do this, but that there are issues around childcare, and we can talk about that in greater depth. The free breakfast program, the health clinic. I mean, there's so many parts of it that come out of a community of activists really trying to think through what a family can look like, and family meaning like community.
And what people's needs were. You have to imagine, for example, the breakfast program was our first really big program. And at that time, there was no such thing as free breakfast for children in schools. I mean, that's one of the ways that we changed society. There was no notion that children needed food in their stomachs to go to school and learn. And so we started that. And it's interesting to me because I hear from women who are young feminists, well, serving breakfast, isn't that women's work? But no, men and women were cooking that food and serving it. But what we were doing was addressing the need of children. And in Chicago, when we first announced that we were going to start this program, we had gathered all this food to open a breakfast program on the west side at the Better Boys Foundation. And the night before the program was supposed to open, the police broke in there and smashed up the food. They even urinated on it and just made it so we couldn't open it. So we had a press conference there and showed what they did and talked about hunger in Chicago and how there were children who didn't have enough to eat. And so many donations of food poured into us. And one of the major newspapers then ran a big series on hunger. And so we used to talk about, we considered that heightening the contradictions, and that things would change when you heighten the contradictions. So from our perspective, it wasn't that you were necessarily doing women's work at a breakfast program. So I don't know that I ever cooked any food there, but that we were all pitching in together to do that. The same with the daycare center. I was the person who initiated the idea of daycare, both in the Bay Area and in Chicago, because I had a child. And my grandmother started the first nursery school in Washington, D.C., black or white. So I came from a family that believed in the value of early childhood education, that's what gave children a jump start on life. And so I fought for it, but I wasn't there just taking care of people's children. Everybody was sharing in that responsibility.
Well, I think that's part of what, when we think about the gender equality or the radical gender, the kind of the way in which gender norms were being re-envisioned, is the fact that you had men doing what would be traditionally seen as like the domestic work as a political act, and women being in this kind of upwardly mobile political system. And so even if the public image was really, heteronormative, or the way in which the media responded to it, the practice was really, really much more fluid. And I think that's part of what I find, part of what I for those who know the Panther Party, it's obvious, but I think a lot of people don't know. And part of that's because the experiences and voices of the women, even though they were so significant during the Panther Party itself, have been historically invisibilized. And with that comes the way in which you guys were really experimenting with gender norms and political orientation. I mean, it was a lot going on, and you were, again, so young doing it.
We
So
were kind of finding our way.
Yeah. But one of the things I always hear is that even if the revolution that you all envisioned could never really come to fruition because of state repression, it did revolutionize, you all did revolutionize the world.
We did. I mean, what public school system doesn't have free breakfast and free lunch now for children who are under a certain income? We started free health clinics by going out. My father had been president of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, And we started the first health clinic in Chicago, and doctors from Medical Committee for Human Rights supported us in that. And that idea of free health care for people was like unthought of. And within 5 to 10 years, there were health clinics in neighborhoods across many of the things that we said and did, even down to expressions, power to the people or right on, were absorbed by people, even though we didn't ever have state power. We impacted society a lot.
So one of the things I've been thinking about in this moment, in relationship to Nixon, is the ability for Black Lives Matter, and I'm just thinking this out loud. I don't have a theory, because I do know that many of the activists are under state surveillance. They've been harassed,
I'm sure
obviously, by the police, quite publicly or not. But what does it mean to have a movement in the era of an African American president? Is Black Lives Matter in some ways less under state surveillance, which seems crazy because we're under more state surveillance than anything else, than with Nixon? Or, I'm thinking about this because right now in Iowa, people are really deciding, at least who amongst the two political parties, partly deciding who the presidential candidates could be. And so, and I wonder about Black Lives Matter under Trump, let's say, or Cruz.
Well, it would be no different from what we had with Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing about society. You get these extremes. In fact, I read something in the past few days. I can't remember where I read it, but the person's theory was that you could analogize what's going on now with these wacky candidates with what happened in the 60s.
With the Nixon's
Richard
rise
Nixon.
and the...
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, so what, you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Well, there was a whole
we didn't all read the
because
article.
there was this whole notion. His thing was the silent majority, and who are the Trump followers but the silent majority? There are people out there who genuinely feel that if there is affirmative action, or if an African American benefits from anything, that's taking something from them, as they just so genuinely believe that in their superiority that it's inconceivable to them that an African American, I mean, look at the things that they've done to Obama as president. Would you ever have had a president before where people are just going around openly saying he's not really a citizen and still challenging him to show his birth certificate? I mean, they do so many obnoxious things that they feel entitled. One time I heard, before Trump was actually running, I heard him interview where he was complaining about the way Barack Obama walks. And he said that it was especially offensive to him the way that Barack Obama comes down the steps of the airplane. He said, it's just like some dude coming down the steps. And we're thinking, yeah, that's why we want him as our president. He's our dude, right? But one person can't turn the tide. If anything, it puts other people more on the defensive.
So I guess so there's a lot of analogies. So in the civil rights movement, in the backlash, people compared it to like emancipation, Reconstruction, the backlash against Reconstruction, and the rise of Jim Crow. And now we're starting to compare this moment, or at least what could be the next moment, to civil rights movement, Black Power movement, and then state repression, the rise of the silent majority, another backlash. And then there's been, so the current comparison would be the emergence of this radical movement that's exposing the systemic racial violence that African Americans continue to experience, both visible and sometimes invisible, or at least unrecognized, and the kind of anxiety that comes about with the election, the double election of the first African American president, meaning that there not only is Trump perhaps the fracturing of the Republican Party, the rise of the Tea Party itself, representing a backlash, but that there's a way in which we can maybe anticipate what could be on the horizon, state repression, the ongoing retrench. You know what I mean?
Or think of ways, alternatives.
Exactly.
I
Let's talk
consider
about
this
that.
a third Reconstruction.
Okay.
I think of what you learn in schools of Reconstruction is the first Reconstruction.
Yes, exactly.
And the civil rights movement, mid-century civil rights movement into the 60s as the second Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And I consider this a third, and I'm very hopeful that this will
So, but knowing
go
that,
farther.
so knowing that each Reconstruction
Mm-hmm.
came with, I mean, you are an
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
the Black Panther
yeah.
Party is the prime example
Yeah.
of a second Reconstruction being suppressed in very violent and hostile ways by the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that people in this room or in the cyber world, what is it that we can do? Because we know history is cyclical, at least we're trying to break that cycle. Do we imagine another, not the rise of Jim Crow or the rise of Nixon, but something else on the horizon that's
Yeah,
similar?
I just don't know. I mean, if I knew the answer, I'd win the Nobel Peace
Yeah,
Prize.
okay.
But
This is true.
But one thing that I'm hopeful about is that with Black Lives Matter, for example, it was very touching to me when Michael Brown was killed, that to see as many white people out there demonstrating as anyone else. Mm-hmm. And it said to me, well, maybe, I hope this means that there's a new generation that maybe won't fall back on all of that mm-hmm. stuff. Then all of a sudden Donald Trump jumps out of nowhere. And, mm-hmm. But for example, in Washington, a friend of my daughter's, my daughter and a friend organized a thing when that happened, because when they announced that there would be no action taken, they lined 16th Street. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with Washington, but it's essentially shaped like a diamond. And 16th Street is the street that goes down the longest part in the diamond, and the White House is on that path. And they lined 16th Street from the Maryland border down to the White House, where they just had people go out at dusk and stand there with candles, just saying, okay, maybe nothing happened, but we want you to know we're watching, Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just black folks out there. It mm-hmm. was all kinds of people. It was human beings out there. Mm-hmm. And that was encouraging. But I really don't know the answer to that. I wish I did know the answer to it, because mm-hmm. I certainly don't want to say, because things are cyclical, don't struggle. Mm-hmm. You've got to keep struggling. Mm-hmm. But I don't know the answer.
Well, I wonder if part of it may be different strategies, right? So the idea of a leaderful movement makes it, first of all, it is part of the moment that we're in which like a kind of social media web mm-hmm. means that things are decentralized, yeah, right? So that in some ways it reflects the era that we're in, but it also seems to be a useful and pragmatic strategy to learn from the lessons in which in the 60s you had major figures literally assassinated. In the 70s, late 60s and early 70s, the Panther Party also having just people being locked up mm-hmm. or killed off. That to have a decentralized movement may mean it's harder
to get the leaders. But at the same time, look at how many black people, black men especially, are just killed.
Yeah.
I mean, the police can do things with no accountability. And yeah. I'm not saying, I think that we need a society that has police officers, because everybody isn't honest. Some people do bad things. I just want them to go about their jobs in a way that they don't use it to exercise their racist tendencies, that if somebody's murdered, to really find the murderer, instead of just arresting the first black person out there.
So what you're saying is that even if a movement's decentralized, in some ways they're targeting anyway.
Yeah, just all these crazy things that they're like things that you read about what happened in the South that pushed people into the Great Migration, mm-hmm. where people were just had so much, they were faced with so much violence that mm-hmm. they just left. Mm-hmm. And it perhaps this, I don't think that statistically, I don't know the statistics, but it just seems that maybe as you say, it's the impact of social media and people being able to suddenly film stuff. But it's really making us aware of how just in everyday life, we had a thing in front of our house in Washington where a 15-year-old kid was walking in the neighborhood I lived in, has been heavily gentrified, and it's almost like you feel like a stranger in your own hometown. And this 15-year-old kid who lived about a block or two away in subsidized housing was walking through the block to go see his friend, and one of my new neighbor's dog that was like just a little yappy dog bit him. And some people, there's some people who have visceral fear of dogs anyway. So he said to the woman, "Your dog just bit me." And she said, "Oh, let me see your leg. There's no blood. Your pants aren't torn. You're okay." And he was trying to say, "But your dog bit me." And he, they got into a dispute about it. And somebody, her friend who was with us said, "Well, maybe we should call the police." So he said, "Okay, call the police." Because he's thinking the police are going to come and protect him against this aggressive dog. And he even keeps going to where he's going in the next block. And when the police came, and they send out now in gentrified areas, they'll send out 6 police cars for one little incident. So all these police cars pull up, and he saw them, and he walked back up the block because he just knew that the police were coming to assert his right to be able to walk down the street without being bitten by an unrestrained dog. And he ended up being arrested. It's just things like that. We stood out there, we taped it, and we went, so they released him, but if we hadn't been standing there taping it, this is a 15-year-old kid, so what path does that lead him on, that they're arresting him at 15? And she's saying, "Well, I was scared. I didn't know if he was going to come back and try to hurt me or something. He was so mad." There's just so many things like that happen. It's just scary that maybe they aren't killing leaders, but young black men are being either locked up or killed. The statistics are just amazing. It's like, what future do they have? And at least in our public schools in Washington, they aren't being educated either. So I think it manifests itself in a different way.
So, so part of what that story just says is that, and we all know this, I guess, to be true, is that just the kind of existence of black people, the kind of ritual of walking down the street, now also means that you can be arrested without any provocation. We know this is true, but to hear stories after story and knowing people who've experienced it.
It's like, how dare you, the part of the city we live in, first place, Washington has always been known as Chocolate City, right? But now all of a sudden we're Mocha City. And the corridor that I live in was like, when I was growing up in the segregated, when there was de jure segregation, this is where all the black businesses were. This was our neighborhood. And now that we fought for revitalization and got all this investment there. And then since the investment, everybody's being pushed out of the neighborhood, and people will call in and complain to the police if you're sitting on your front porch. When African Americans in a hot summer evening in Washington, that's what you do, is sit on the front porch. And people, they just call in and say, "Well, they must be out there dealing drugs, or they're up to no good." It's really horrible, the way that's been institutionalized.
So I guess I have 2 additional questions. One is about black women who are also being killed by police officers or victims.
I shouldn't make it sound like it's
no.
But they do. I think they do see black men as a bugaboo.
But I just wanted to say, but when we have these cases, so
like Sandra Bland,
whose funeral I attended in Chicago, and it was, it's devastating.
It was.
And then Rekia Boyd, who was killed by a police officer in Chicago, in North Lawndale. And recently, Sandra Bland and Rekia have gotten attention, but still not. When black women or black girls die at the hand of police officers, it's rarely the catalyst for action.
It's like they're expendable.
And there's sometimes a time lag or a delay between when the movement, even in Black Lives Matter, catches up to these women's deaths. And so I just wanted to just, because I asked Patrice and Opal this as well, but how do you explain the time lag when movements are primarily led by women, when the origins are feminist in impulse? Why do you think that there sometimes is a real time lag between the acknowledgement or recognition of these women's lives as worthy of organizing around, and when people kind of spring to action? It's something I'm wrestling with and thinking about.
I think that too much of the general culture is male oriented.
Okay. So it's a male-dominated culture.
Yeah.
So do you think is it internal, or how the organizer, how did you all deal with these things, right? So, was there a time lag? Was there a delay, or did you feel like you were wrestling with these things in real time? And maybe you were, it's just that the world didn't know that you were, or the world didn't want to acknowledge it as such.
I was trying to think, I think we just saw people as being oppressed. I don't think that we looked at that particular issue.
So if the community, whoever was in the community, they were equally oppressed.
Yeah. But I agree about Sandra Bland. That was very upsetting.
Yeah. No, it's just.
And even beyond that, to be honest, one of the things that I've wrestled with, because I retired from government in 2006, and since then I've led this organization called Hope in a Home that's a program for low-income homeless families, and what we're doing is trying to help people remake their lives.
Yeah.
And this summer we had some very, very deep conversations with the young people in our program, because there was so much going on with violence, and on one hand you want to talk about it and you want them to struggle against it. On the other hand, you want them to survive too. Mm-hmm. And it's from that perspective, it's a big challenge.
Yeah. So a lot of the young women that I work with, or our organization works with, live in communities that are over-policed on one hand and under-policed in other areas. Have family members who are incarcerated. Parents oftentimes who've been killed within the community, or died of drug-related, because of drug-related situations. And then at the same time, they're also experiencing like disproportionate forms of gender-based violence, sexual assaults, and domestic violence. And so what's interesting is that these girls live at the kind of like vortex, or they live at the deep intersections of multiple forms of violence. And perhaps because of that, they remain invisible. But what strikes me as, again, unique about the moment that we're in, that pulls from the Black Panther Party and from SNCC, is trying to make these things all visible, equally visible, and not have a kind of competition amongst, violence. But it still, again, seems very difficult.
I just read something in the Washington Post in the past few days of a young woman who, as a very young teenager, was raped, and went and knew. I think in most instances like that, they know who the person is.
Yeah.
And they went to the police, and after a lot of this, that, and the other, she ended up being charged with lying to the police, because whoever was doing it just got away with it. And she was taken from her family, put in foster care, and went through. So now she's just, the reason it was being written about, she's just emerged. She's now independent, and they forced a review of it, and the police chief had to admit that it was wrong, and they're going to go back and reopen it. But when you think about the impact on her life, it's just horrifying that there was so much. I keep doing that. I'm sorry. There was so much sexism there within the police department that it was so easy for them to say, "Oh, she's just lying," or to buy into what the person's saying. "Oh, you can't believe what this girl says," and that is troubling.
And it's obviously a pipeline for incarceration of young girls. It's one of the key, actually, indicators of incarceration, at least this report recently came out from the Ms. Foundation. Sexual assault is like a precursor to being incarcerated for Black girls and girls of color. I guess
Well, and the other pattern that I see in the work I do is when a dysfunction, there's dysfunction in a family and I'm working with them, I can almost always tell when the mother was abused as a child. There are just certain behavior patterns that just never knowing who they could trust, or just having a whole different thing. It's very sad when you see that repeated, when you see the impact that that's now had on a whole family, because, and the mother really is struggling for her children, but it was so dysfunctional the way she was treated when she was young. It's just horrible. It's horrible.
So one of the final questions I have for you is, the current work that you do is an extension of your work in the Panther Party. And there was a report a couple of years ago about African American men being pushed out through being mass incarcerated, disproportionate, we know this. But the report also said African American women are disproportionately being evicted. So you have these two groups that constitute, working class African American, not always, but middle class, sometimes working class, literally being either part of the state because they're being incarcerated, or homeless because they're being kicked out of their housing. And so I don't know if you see in your work, this.
That's why I do the work I do.
So can you just talk about?
Well, my last job when I was working in the city government was as the city's homeless czar, because we were trying to reform the way that the city was addressing homelessness. And during that period was when the real estate market got really crazy in Washington, and all of a sudden these huge prices, property that you never thought was that valuable before now is worth $1 million, and all of that was happening. And what I was seeing where I was sitting was several nights a week I'm going out to a fire where I'm sure it's been arson because the owner of the building just lit it up so that they could. We have very strong tenant laws in Washington. So if you want to change the use of the building, you have to give certain amount of notice, and you have to give people money, and there's all these laws. So to avoid it, people are lighting up the buildings, or just all these things happening. And I'd go there and I'd see a disproportionate number of Black women who were there with their children, and you saw what was a functioning household. And they're bewildered because now they don't have a place to live. There's nothing else in the housing market for them to turn to. And we would at least make the landlord pay for a certain amount of putting them up in a hotel. But invariably, if they didn't have many resources, they'd end up in a family shelter. And I felt that after having been in a family shelter between 30 to 90 days, I could see a family lose all the fabric of their family life. That it just tore it all apart because they're living out in some place that's far from where they had lived. The children, you try to keep the children in the same school, but it's an effort to get them there. The mother has little, if any, control over what's going on. They're living in substandard conditions, and you would just see it deteriorate. And that's become the norm in Washington now. So you have all this expensive real estate, and you have women feeling like they have no control over what can happen to their families. And these are working women. These weren't women who were on welfare. These are women who work, but they don't make enough money to pay rent in the city. And so that's what I struggle for is equitable development, and for finding ways to help people continue their lives, because I believe in my people. I don't think that they should just be cast aside. Or did anybody see the movie The Big Short? I mean, that's what it's about, where Wall Street was betting against minorities and poor people. And they made a whole lot of money off of it, and that's part of what led to this whole era. I mean, it's really horrible.
So, I mean, think it's one more question.
Okay.
Well, I mean,
Is it becoming depressing?
no. Well, my follow-up question was going to be is really depressing because I was thinking about you just that scene, that moment where you talked about seeing that mother, and then recently I'm a mother of a 3.5-year-old girl and a 4-month-old boy, and the other day I was on NPR listening to radio and Flint, and there was a mother who's an organizer in Flint. She's been a community organizer for a very long time, and now has to think about leaving Flint. And she talked about giving her daughter a bath and how the ritual, again, back to these ideas of rituals of living, walking down the street, getting bitten by a dog and then getting arrested, giving your child a nightly bath, and now that bath is, you can't do
You
it.
don't know what the long-term implications are going to be for your child.
And so I'm having a similar visceral response to the story of, the fire.
And do you see people, I hope this isn't offensive to people, but when things happened in Paris, everybody was, je suis Paris. Do you see anybody saying, I am Flint? What reaction do people have? It's horrible. It's horrible. And there's still, nobody has really yet come up with any solutions.
Well, it just seems to me that
they're still talking real estate value. The last thing I watched on that, they said the problem is that replacing the pipes, the houses aren't worth as much as it costs to replace the pipes. So what they're saying is these people who live in these houses are worthless because they can't see, they don't think that's a good investment to replace the pipes in their houses.
So it just seems to me, and I'm going to open it up, this is where the Panther platforms were so useful because it enabled us to see that racial injustice is not only police brutality or police violence, which it is, but to think about the various ways in which families and individuals and communities are impacted by systemic racial violence and gender inequity and capitalism, and then came up with a whole bunch of different types of solutions and programs to address that. And this is, again, the era that we're in, where we're seeing this kind of emergence. It's almost like a hydra head, many heads of racial injustice. We have Flint, we have, Chicago, we have, Detroit ongoing, whether it's schools, Baltimore. I mean, and yet to resolve or to deal with these things honestly and sincerely requires so many different types of strategies and programs and revolutionary belief and love, I think. So I just want to thank you for that. And this is why the Panthers are so important, because they gave us many answers.
But we were inspired by many of these same things that are still happening.
Yeah, exactly.
And felt that we should not accept them.
I'm going to open it up to the audience. You can obviously ask Lynn. You can ask me questions too, but I assume you're going to ask them to Lynn. So I'll call on people. So in the green.
Hello, thank you for speaking today. So my question is, first, do you think racial injustice is a public health problem? And if it is, what would be the public health solution that a Department of Health could do?
Well, my sister's here who has a master's in public health. Maybe she can answer that. But I think that it is a public health problem. I think that violence is a public health problem. I don't think you can separate any of these issues from public health. And perhaps the fact that so many things are accepted says that we don't even live in a mentally healthy society, that people accept these things. But the only way it changes is for people to struggle against them. There's no one person who has an answer and no one organization. It requires everyone in whatever you choose as your path in life to struggle against it. In fact, in this course that I teach, I teach at UVA, History of the Civil Rights Movement, I know that none of those students that I'm teaching are going to go major in civil rights and be a but what I consider it is you think of your, once you have these ideas, you think of yourself as having a really bad cold. And you think that when you sneeze on somebody, they catch your germs. And I think that we all have an obligation to try to sneeze on as many people as we can to help change even the way people think about things. So in whatever path you choose for yourself, please sneeze on people.
Mm-hmm. In the, I don't know what color that, camel
Yeah.
jacket.
Hi, my question was about, you shared the story about like the murdering of Fred and how the police officers had that picture and laughed at it. And it made me think about now, like if a young black male is murdered, it's like public backlash. Like it's a thing. We make it very clear that it's not okay. But at the end of the day, like you already said, like young black males are still being murdered at these alarming rates. So I guess my question is, what is the role of public backlash in these murders? How do you think it's symbolic of shifting time? And do you really think it has a big impact?
I think we have to keep fighting back. There was an article in today's New York Times where they were comparing the impact of this movement on New York versus Chicago, and saying, now you all live in New York, I don't live here, but they were saying that there has been much more reform in Chicago in terms of addressing how police officers approach things. In Chicago, those police officers are saying that the reason that there's so many murders there is because the American Civil Liberties Union and Black Lives Matter come out so harsh on them if they do anything that they just turn their backs on things.
In Chicago.
In Chicago. I mean, it was incredible that they even claimed this, and that they don't see any solution, and the statistics are getting worse in Chicago, whereas they were saying in New York at least there's some improvement.
So they're blaming Black Lives Matter and the ACLU for police
because
shooting.
They're saying whenever they shoot someone, they now have to fill out reports on their interaction.
Yeah.
And the first place they say the reporting takes too long because the questions are too involved and it takes them away from the streets. And they claim that they're gun shy because of this.
But it doesn't seem like they're gun shy.
No, heck no.
I mean, I just wanted that on the
They go,
the record.
somebody's calling for help because their mentally ill son is having an episode, and it ends up that not only is the mentally ill son murdered, but their neighbor is murdered. It's like, it's just, that's why I'm so really feeling the way I'm feeling about Chicago police. It's like it's so inbred. They just really feel entitled to do these things and don't think that they should be held accountable by anyone.
And it's not ironic, I suppose, but the fact that, the We Charge Genocide movement was successful in the sense of getting reparations for men who've been tortured, or particularly one tortured by police officers there. This is coming on the kind of heels of that, right? Like you have this.
Talking about the Burge.
Yes, and then
the main lawyer for that he started out as our lawyer.
Oh,
and they were just out of law school and they called themselves the People's Law Office.
Yep.
Flint Taylor.
Yep.
Really good guy.
And then you have this moment of reparations, and then yet at the same time, all this cover up has been going on and was going on. It's kind of tales of two Chicago.
Well, for years they didn't even think they had to cover it up because they weren't held accountable.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, and then we'll go over here. The stripes.
Yeah, stripes. Yeah.
Where?
You talked a lot about how the Black Panther movement, you said that the average age was under 25. The Black Lives Matter movement is a very youth-centered movement. I was wondering if you could make one change in how we educate youth to sort of create the most effective and empowered youth organizers we can, so maybe the next generation of revolutionaries doesn't have to reinvent the wheel.
like I said, if I had the answer, I'd win the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm encouraged that they're young, and I think it's great. We used to say youth makes the revolution. And we used to try to be very thoughtful about the way that we even dealt with our own children, because that's a quotation from Chairman Mao. But youth makes the revolution. So your experiences are different from ours. One of the only constant things in life is change. So each generation looks to the next to be the one that really makes the ultimate change, to bring the ultimate solution.
I guess for me what's inspiring too is the ways in which, because it's a young movement, both in terms of chronology but also so youth-led, that the questions or the demands that they're making on even my generation about what kinds of Black lives should matter are really, really important and significant and radical, right? Like, because it's a generation that have grown up with more gender fluidity, outwardly so, and really challenging like heteronormativity in radical ways. It just keeps on, I think, pushing my generation and then your generation to really, really be deeply inclusive. And I think it's a movement in which you see like self-correction. Like, how do you keep on centering those who are most marginal, even within the African American community, right? How do you use those who are value the experiences of those who are most marginal as a way of creating a radically democratic future? I mean, I think that, at my generation, because I'm like the hip hop generation, I think we were wrestling with these questions and really, and in some ways are part of, but it's really just, it's amazing to see at its best the ways in which what we took for granted as like normative are being challenged. And yet there's this sense that Blackness is this open, fluid, rich category that is inclusive of so many different things. I mean, I think that's both like new, but also echoing the kind of tensions and the issues that previous movements were really thinking about. Yes. Oh, and then, yes, and I'm calling everyone with their colors, gray and then stripes again.
Okay.
If anyone back there, please let me know.
Yeah, just wave your hand.
Thank you both for this conversation. It was a privilege to be here for it. I have a question kind of relating to your Chairman Mao reference, which is I think of the Black Panthers movement and its influence internationally and the kinds of conversations that were happening in the height of the anti-colonial movement. I was just in Australia and was meeting with Indigenous Aboriginal activists who talked about how the Black Panthers inspired their movement. And I just wonder what either of you have to say about the kind of global context of the current movement, or how the international shaped your thinking then and now. Thank you.
Well, we were international in scope. And seems like I'm always hearing about another place where people say we were influenced. It's pretty amazing. The Chairman Mao thing was, we looked to Mao and the Chinese Revolution, and it's interesting because when I visited China, some of my feelings about Chairman Mao might have changed a little bit.
Yeah.
but I guess I'm not giving you might be able to give a deeper answer to this, but I just see it as an affirmation that people feel that way. And we were even surprised. It wasn't that we were intentionally saying, let's reach out to the Aboriginal people in Australia. We were just saying, this is how the world should be, and this is how people should be treated. And the big affirmation is that resonated with so many different people in so many different circumstances that it's amazing. It's amazing.
I'll speak on what I've heard. I guess Opal Tomati was talking about, going to Germany and Black Lives Matter, kind of a different version. It's almost like a Afro-German version emerging there. And then I remember following when a group of Black Lives Matter activists here went to Gaza, went to Palestine, right? And so on one hand, kind of linking struggles, and then at the same time, also coming to terms with the fact that like anti-blackness is also like a global phenomenon, right? So that there are these important sites of solidarity, and also there's a kind of a commonness of like an anti-blackness that I think is a kind of a useful term that I think emerges in this moment. There's like white supremacy, racism, and then the kind of the specificity of anti-blackness. So I think your question, I mean, that's another thing that wonderfully comes out of the film, but I also think there's a way in which we think of these anti-racist movements in the United States as solely about kind of gaining access to the United States and getting full citizenship. But if we think about most of the anti-racist movements have been internationalists, right? So they're always, whether if we think about Du Bois and the Bandung Conference, or we think about Garvey's many, we think about King going to Nkrumah's ceremony when he becomes, so even the civil rights movement, the movement
Well,
that we don't
it's tied
think of.
to anti-colonialism.
Exactly.
And we used to say that if you looked at the common link between colonized societies, basically the way we, maybe somebody who's an economist would differ with me, but the way we viewed being colonized was that somebody came in and conquered you, and you had an asset in your country, whether it's sugar cane or gold or whatever, and they came because they wanted that asset, and they would sort of just change your society so that everybody's working to produce this asset for them, and then you ultimately are divorced from your own culture and your own ways of supporting yourself, so you even maybe have to start relying on them to even buy groceries because you've stopped doing all the other things. And we always thought of ourselves, African Americans, as being the archetypical colonized people, because not only were we colonized, but we were colonized for labor. So they totally divorced us from our land and brought us here to provide free labor to build this wonderful country. And so I really see that as the link that we all have in common.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I was thinking about your question with regard to time lag and when violence happens to African American women. And what I thought about was at least some of the statistics saying how many of our households are led by women. And I know with my contemporaries, if one of my friends was murdered, there's a linchpin of both an older generation that would suffer and a younger generation that would suffer. So there'd be this huge vacuum there and this hole that might exist where people can't protest as quickly, maybe when we lose men. And in this time, especially with my friends closer to my 40s now, and they have real fear about their sons not coming home and their daughters being abused. And while we want to make a better world for our children and protest, we're trying to figure out how to maintain some sense of home and community. How do you do that, or how did you do that, living in fear? Because even in protest, you had to have lived in fear. How do you do that?
We didn't have all the answers now, but that was I think that's the story of African Americans in this country, generation after generation, is that fear, whether it's somebody who's not being compliant enough as an enslaved person, so they're whipped to death or otherwise tortured, or whether it's an enslaved woman being sexually abused by someone who thinks that they own her, or on into after the Civil War with the Great Migration. That's why people left, going north thinking they were going to find a better world. They found a different set of problems, but got away from the immediate. I mean, that's the recurring problem. And the only thing you can do is to be strong for yourself and your family. because the one thing that you have in that situation is the love and support that you have for each other. I have 3 nephews. I come from a very large family, and I have 3 nephews who live at my house now in Washington. And I hear a gunshot in the neighborhood, and I'll call up and see, is everybody okay? And they think, oh, you're so silly. But it's like, I know what could happen, you know. And that never completely goes away. Only thing you can do is stand strong.
Becky has a Becca.
Becky.
Becky. Okay, that's what I thought. Then I was like,
But this question is not from me, actually.
oh, okay, okay.
We got a question through the live stream,
Oh, okay.
which I'm going to read to you.
Wow.
I know, it's really exciting. This is the first time this has ever happened. So I'm just going to read it. Good evening. First, thank you for hosting such a timely discussion. I'm working on my dissertation on women in the Black Panther Party at the University of Connecticut. My question, I was wondering if Lynn had thoughts about the silence on Black women's vulnerability. I wonder if she had thoughts on the Daniel Holtzclaw case and the sexual assault of 13 Black women.
Okay, what was the first part? If I had the silence of what?
Silence on Black women's vulnerability.
If you have thoughts on the silencing around Black women's vulnerability? Okay.
I don't know that I have anything else. I'm not familiar with that case. I'm embarrassed to say, so I can't.
I can speak on the case, but
Like-
but maybe you could talk about what it meant to be. I don't know if I'm trying to help this person with their dissertation.
Yeah, I don't understand.
You know,
Something.
the particular ways in which Black women are vulnerable in the Panther Party,
Oh, she's talking specifically about Black women.
and then we can talk about the Holtzclaw case.
Well, I
afterwards.
know that there are things out there where people have asserted different things about Black women in the Black Panther Party, and I didn't personally experience any of that. To draw an analogy, maybe this isn't maybe you won't be sympathetic to this, but I recently went to Cuba with my daughter and with a dear sister friend from the party, and we were at the Women's Center, and we were talking with a woman who's on the Central Committee of Cuba, and somebody asked, "What do you do in terms of domestic violence in Cuba? And do you have shelters for the women who are abused? And do you have special ways to do this, that, and the other for them?" And the woman's response was, in Cuba, domestic violence is illegal. And she kept saying that back, and finally it was like, okay, so if there's domestic violence, the man is locked up and the woman is, you know, and that's basically how I feel about it too. If I saw something like that, I definitely wouldn't be silent on it. But without knowing what specific thing she's talking about, I don't know what else I could say.
Well, maybe we could talk about a little bit about women who were pregnant and who were locked up by. I mean, because one of the things, at least in terms of some of the more high-profile cases that we know about with Panther women who were locked up, they were oftentimes pregnant. And so I know this year, the governor of New York just passed, or I guess last year, legislation that if women who were incarcerated, they couldn't be shackled while they were in labor. I mean, that's a really radical, not radical. It's a radical thought, I suppose, but even though it's the most, for anyone who's been, whatever, I don't have to explain why that's so necessary. But it does strike me as there are ways in which Panther women experience state violence because they were mothers or because they were pregnant that we don't, talk about, but that are unique or maybe a kind of specific vulnerability that women. I don't know if that's what this
I don't know
person-
if that's what that. See, I can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, no one wants it. Well, I mean, the Holtzclaw case, again, this is this idea of time lag, but I think some people are more familiar with it now. He was a police officer who systematically raped African.
Oh, the man in the
Yeah,
Midwest.
yeah,
Okay,
in
I saw that
Oklahoma
on the-
City.
I didn't remember
Okay.
his name.
Yeah.
And he just got locked up for 1,000,000 years or something.
265.
That's what he
65 years.
deserved.
Yeah. But I mean, primarily, I mean, I don't know if this person asked me this question, but I do feel familiar with the case and feel comfortable talking about it. I mean, again, talk about time lags. Like, this is a case in which you have police violence
against women who were
primarily,
sex workers, so they weren't. So nobody gave any credibility to their.
And the reason that it came forward was because one of the women was they call her like a grandmother, but she's an older woman who had no record, and so she was the one who felt comfortable going to the police. But I mean, again, the way in which certain stories or certain victims of state violence get left out and left behind, and a lot of it had to do with the reason we know about this case is because a lot of the organizing of African American women in Oklahoma City, Artists for Justice in particular, really led the way to create visibility around this issue. But what's unusual is that an all-white jury found him not guilty of all the charges, and so we have to, some women were believed more than others, but that an all-white jury found him guilty, and that this is a kind of unprecedented, obviously, sentencing. So, I mean, it's. Okay, so back there and then over here. Second to last row.
So I heard you say earlier that you think one of the problems with police right now is how much they're letting racism creep into their practices and how maybe there could be a system of policing where that didn't happen. And so I guess I'm curious, a couple of things. One, if you think as well that like prisons should exist and could be more just, and sort of just an extension of that, like what a just system of policing and justice, incarceration, whatever it might look like, could be.
Well, I mean, I personally believe that there are certain crimes that need to be punished, like the police officer who raped all these women. I think within that context, prison is justifiable. It's just that we've gotten to the point now where prison is an industry in this country. They've privatized the prisons so that in many instances they're no longer a public institution, and because there's profit to be made, it's almost like it's in people's interest to keep putting more and more people in so you can make more and more money. It sort of brings back to mind the period right after the Reconstruction, where really horrible things happened in the South, and one of them was there was a whole thing of peonage where on one hand they would make it illegal for a black person to be idle, but there were certain restrictions on what work you could do. So if you were, let's say you got arrested because somebody thought you looked at a white woman the wrong way, you could get locked up for 50 years, and then you would be sent to work on somebody's plantation to pick their cotton. So I think what you have to do is you have to separate whether prison is a function of legitimate punishment for wrongdoing, or if it's something that's promoting somebody's private wealth. And then once you do it, people do have to, I don't, like the whole thing of putting people in the hole. I think that you not only should young people not be put in the hole the way the president, but I think it's abusive with adults because you just make people worse. Somebody who could be perfectly sane, if they're in the hole for 2 years, then they're going to be stark raving mad when they come out. So I think that there does need to be prison reform, but I don't think that I can't perceive of a society where there's no punishment for wrongdoing. I just think that the people who are punishing people have to have they have to follow certain rules for proving that someone is a wrongdoer, and there has to be a really fair trial, and no one else should be profiting from their punishment. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Oh, that's the green and then the red.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Erica Jones, and I teach high school history. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming and convening this conversation. And one of the questions that I had for you is I'm just thinking about the comment that you made earlier in terms of being, sort of delighted by seeing so many white people come out and march for Michael Brown. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is just I love the fact that, the Black Panther Party was so unapologetically Black. And I was hoping you could actually speak to, some of the tensions with, sort of white involvement in anti-racist movements. And I'm thinking specifically about, for instance, there was several protests and sort of candlelight vigils for Michael Brown. And I'm thinking about ways in which many Black people see that as, sort of ownership of a safe space in order just seeing liberation movements as being that safe space for Black people, and ways in which that can be disrupted by white presence and sort of a recentering of whiteness and, perhaps even a co-opting of those movements. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit to that tension insofar as thinking about white allyship, but also, maintaining safe spaces to practice liberation for Black people.
Not at all. I was just saying that I think that you've got to have white people agree that Black Lives Matter, or you'll still have the same cycles in this country. That's where I was coming from with that comment. We had similar things to that in the 60s. As you say, we were unapologetically Black, but there were certain movements and people that we had disagreements with. For example, I don't know if I should call any names. Well, Weatherman, I don't know if you know what Weatherman was. Well, in Chicago, the national headquarters of Weatherman was walking distance down the street from our headquarters on West Madison. And on one hand, they were big allies, but on the other hand, they were always trying to push us to do things that we didn't think were the right thing to do. So, for example, they had this period where they had Days of Rage. I don't know, as a historian, if anybody's ever read about Days of Rage, where they were going down to the downtown Chicago to the Loop to demonstrate, and they thought all these people would turn out, and they didn't. So they trashed downtown, and they did a lot of damage. And as they retreated, they ran up into public housing, and none of them were shot. None of them was shot. None of them had any long-term implications to their lives. And some young Black guys were actually shot by the police who were supposedly pursuing them. So we had to have some serious words with them about that. And it may have even been more than words. But we had to seriously register our disagreement with that, because on one hand, they saw themselves as pushing the right thing, but what they were doing was being insensitive to who was paying the price for that. Or even if you look at once they went underground when Fred was murdered, and they were underground for a number of years, and they were bombing places, and then when they turned themselves back in, I haven't seen anybody pay any, I'm not saying that they should have been given life sentences, but can you imagine? There's still Panthers. There are Panthers who are still locked up. Can you imagine the tables having been turned on that? What would have happened to us if we had done something like that? So I agree that there are different sensibilities, and I think that we do have to own our own movement, and we do have to be true to what we see. What I see in Black Lives Matter is that Black people are leading it, whether white people want to support it or not. I think it's great for them to support it, but what's important is that it's these young Black women who have initiated this movement and that people are following it. Mm-hmm. That in and of itself, to me, is progressive. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. So I've been thinking about how to ask this question, and I want to try to get you to talk a little bit more about being a woman in the party. I know that a lot of things are controlled by a male-dominated media, and the images we have, that the party was a vanguard in feminist thinking as well as in other ways. But at the same time, it's kind of, when I was in New Haven 1969-70 and attended many meetings, public meetings, I can't remember a single one that had a female person up on the stage. I can visualize these images.
One of
They're
the
very
leaders of that period is one of my dearest friends, a woman named Audrey Jones.
so my question is,
women were directing that.
my question is can you did you ever encounter were the men just already so completely good and perfect about their feminist ideology that those were never issues, that the men really didn't want to take the lead and they really wanted the women to be equally? I just wanted you to say a little more about whether there were times when those were issues, or it really was already kind of worked out in a way that it never presented itself.
Nothing has ever worked out, just as even if your friend, you have a white friend who says that they agree with you that racism is bad, it doesn't mean that you won't disagree on things. Nothing is ever completely worked out with people. Struggle continues. I wasn't around New Haven, but I do know that there were women who not only were paying huge consequences in terms of being locked up,
Oh yeah,
but
absolutely.
also who were leading that. But no.
I mean, I guess I was just
I mean,
curious.
It wasn't,
Were there times when the women were sort of trying to struggle to make the feminist case, or it was really already made in a way that?
I mean, so part of my interviewing people was trying to wrestle with this question, and Elaine Brown in the documentary says, that the men didn't come from revolutionary heaven, that they had to, and then Tracy talked about a little bit about living together and really and the struggles, like
it's a daily struggle.
Yeah, that it was. Everyone's a product of the same patriarchal society, that they're trying to imagine an alternative, and yet there were real battles I think come about when you're trying to change.
You never heard a woman speak at any rally there?
I don't remember it. I'm not saying I didn't, but my own imagination.
To ask about that, I just can't.
But
I mean, I know Dougie Miranda was probably the one who was the most vocal there, and he was somebody who submitted to the leadership of Audrey Jones, because when this started, there wasn't a chapter in New Haven. The closest chapter was Boston, and it was led by a woman, and they came down there. But I didn't mean to imply that there were never any disagreements or that people didn't think they could do one thing or another. There were people who were purged from the party for sexist things and for trying to take advantage of people. I mean, life is a struggle, and being in the party was a struggle. But
and I guess for me, what's been most interesting is that we have these narratives of feminism, and the Panthers are not part of that conversation, or at least that historical remembrance. And yet there were real-time debates, and the other thing I guess I want to say is that, from what my understanding is, that a lot of times these conversations push the party, right? Like that women who were befriending each other, who were fellow Panther members, were really, through the newspaper or through the education classes, having these conversations and pushing the party to catch up with them. And that wasn't easy.
No, it wasn't easy.
But it was part of what was happening as people were defining themselves, and they're trying to redefine a nation. So I don't think that
But at the same time, we were in New Haven fighting for Erica Huggins' life.
Exactly. That's what
I mean, they wanted to send her to they wanted to send her and Bobby Seale to the electric chair.
Yeah.
So, you have to keep that in mind as well.
All right, so one more final question. Okay. Hand up over there. So we got
I don't need a mic. It's being loud. I just need to say that.
Oh,
It's being taped, so I think they want your.
I need a mic. I just wanted to say that I'm one of the youth who was in New Haven, and I did go to the morning breakfast program.
In New Haven?
Yes, I did. And I believe it was on Congress Avenue. Dixwell. I forgot. Yeah, I lived in New Haven. And I was 9, 8, something like that. And I did go to the morning breakfast programs. I even came back after school. You know, I had to do my homework there, and stuff like that. And in the morning, the men served us, right? And then when I came in the afternoon for the after school program, that's when I dealt with the women more so. They would sit us down and help us with our lessons and things like that. So what I noticed at that time was there were a lot of women in leadership, and it wasn't because it was like they were like, who's gonna run this and who's, it had more to do with whose jobs were what. And for instance, the teachers, you know, a lot of them had to be somewhere early in the morning, the women. So the men were the one who took care of the breakfast programs and stuff like that. But there was, I recall there was plenty of women who were doing things. I mean, they were organized and they taught me things at a young age, you know, and the men, it seemed like the media was the one that showed all the men, you know, and sometimes it wasn't in a good light. You know, lots of times the men were out in the communities. They were just trying to make sure that a lot of the police brutality and stuff that was going down, they were kind of like monitoring it and stuff, you know. So it was different reasons why men were where they were at what time and women were where they were at what time and stuff. But it seemed like they were working together pretty good.
And also people, you know, when it came to who's going to speak, everybody isn't a public speaker. Everyone isn't a public speaker. So I just can't say anything more specific about that because I just was never in New Haven. Yeah. But I do know that there are assertions of and I don't deny that there weren't sexist things that happened. I just think that they were dealt with differently. Right. And that we struggled with them. Right.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for our speakers tonight. Equal parts upsetting and inspiring and lots of food for thought. You received a booklet with the next events for Black History Month. We have a film showing for 12 Years a Slave on Wednesday. Our webpage, urbandemos.nyu.edu, has Urban Democracy Lab events. But once again, thank you.